Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Throughout the day, as you know, we've had the opportunity to discuss how the proposed City Council budgets will affect young people in Newcastle. And I believe it's been fruitful so far. You know, the first workshop went very well. And this is the time that most people have been waiting for. So I welcome you to the Newcastle Youth Council Summit 2013 panel debate. And it's at this point that you can put your questions directly to the people making decisions that will affect your future. I'm going to introduce the panelists here today. To my immediate right is the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and the Deputy Leader of the Newcastle City Council, Councillor Joyce McCarthy. She's been a councillor since 1994, so she's been a councillor for 18 years. She's passionate about equality. She works in education. She's a school advisor. She's lived in the West End of Newcastle for too many years, in her words, 35 years, and her interests include reading and nice holidays. So if you could put hands together for Joyce McCarthy. To my left is the youth work academic. She teaches at Durham University, and she's a local anti-cuts campaigner, representing her own views here today, but also a campaign called In Defense of Youth Work. She's also part of the Save Our Services campaign. Anne is concerned with young people having a say in democratic decision making. She's concerned with equality amongst young people and creating safe spaces for young people to air their views. Thank you for joining us here today, Anne. Thank you. And finally on the panel is the leader of the Liberal Democrats in Newcastle and leader of the opposition at the City Council, Councillor David Faulkner. He was a former leader of the council briefly in 2010-2011, and he's been a councillor for 14 years. He was first elected when he was in his 20s, and he was a councillor for about 4 years. He's returned since 2004. He represents Fordham Ward. He used to represent Elsick. His interests include culture, economic development, and international affairs. He was born in Byker and has lived in Newcastle all his life. Thank you for joining us, David. So throughout the day today, we've been, opportune to have with us the Chief Executive of Children's North East, Jeremy Cripps. So if you could please put your hands together for him. Children's North East is concerned with ensuring that the rights of young people are taken into account, and just making sure that young people and children indeed are taken care of in the North East. We also have Doug Hallam, who's the regional coordinator for the British Youth Council. The British Youth Council supports the Youth Council network across the country. They also manage the United Kingdom Youth Parliament, and they just ensure that young people's voices are heard. Thank you very much for joining us, Doug. We have also received regards and support from the newly elected Police and Crime Commissioner Vera Baird and from Catherine McKinnell, a Member of Parliament for Newcastle North. And of course here with us we have so many volunteers and workers. Okay, I'm going to ask David Bell to follow up on that. He has a question as well. We're going to need the microphone to move quickly.
How can the City Council say they are looking after vulnerable young people and then go ahead and shut down TV View?
Councillor McCarthy, I'm going to direct that question to you first.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing your views, actually. And I'm really pleased that you're able to give feedback on these cards that are out there, and I hope you're writing in lots of ideas, because I hope you're not here to listen to me. I hope you're here to put forward your own views. The question that you've asked is about why certain areas are affected, and we say we're looking after vulnerable young people and yet making significant changes in services. Remember, these are just proposals, and there will be opportunities for further discussion about all of these proposals, and I would love us not to be in this position and putting forward ideas of closing services. But the background, as I'm sure you've heard this morning, is that Newcastle are faced with £100 million worth of cuts over the next 3 years, and that means that almost everything that the council do will be affected in one way or another. And sadly, some of the proposals that we've made, like the closure of Cheviot View, are part of that. I think what we are saying, even if those proposals go ahead, for Cheviot View in particular, if that proposal goes ahead, we will be working out how to continue to support the families who use that respite centre. So we might be providing it in a different way, but that support will be still available for families.
Sorry, just before I pass on to David, this morning we were opportune to have a parent come in with her son who suffers from autism, and she did explain her situation. It was very distinct, and I believe there are many of them around the country, around the city, who experienced that. In her personal case, the marriage did not stand, so the father left. Her other daughter left as well. Then her daughter returned and then had a baby. You know, she obviously has gone to Cheviot View for help and for assistance, and her fear is that many of the parents who may fall into that situation won't actually have the advice and guidance. So I mean, is it wise, is it even smart for the council to initially decide, obviously I know you have said it's a proposal, but if it does go ahead and Cheviot View closes, and then begin to have parents and families suffering? How about, you know, it's a gradual process, as opposed to just going in the first year and just completely shutting down Cheviot View, because those are a lot of vulnerable people. I mean, we're not talking about people who, you know, work. I mean, she was describing her son Dominic, and you know, he would never, you know, go to school. I mean, like, you know, go get a degree from university or work. So I mean, is it not just too drastic a measure at this initial point?
I've already said I'm not. We're not taking any delight in any of these proposals. They're awful. They're absolutely awful, and people will suffer, and we accept that. What we're trying to do is make sure that if this proposed closure were to go ahead, and we've heard from other families in the city, lots of those families have made a response to the consultation, and we will try and find other solutions, but we might have to find cheaper solutions, and they might not actually be as close as they currently are. But we will intend to ensure that that kind of support is available, because, as you've said from the people who were here today, it's tragic, and those people deserve as much support as the council can offer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's pass on to David.
Thank you. What you'll find as the course of this discussion goes on is that there are a number of areas where Joyce and I, albeit in different political parties, agree, but there will be some areas where we have a different perspective as well, and it depends on your questions what you bring out. Let me say that my prediction is that the final decisions will not be the same as the draft decisions, and that there will be some changes, and I hope so, because that's the point of a consultation. And it will depend on two things. One is the strength of opinion of those who are lobbying against the proposals, and you just have to look at all the websites, the e-petitions that have been set up against the arts cuts, the libraries cuts, the city hall, the city pool, the youth facilities, the respite care centres, that there is obviously a great strength of feeling. And they can't all be saved, because the truth of the matter is that the council is facing a pretty desperate position. However, I believe that some will be saved, and it depends partly on that strength of lobbying and partly on the extent to which councillors and others can come up with alternative savings to help balance the budget. And perhaps that's what this is about, because hopefully we'll come up with some ideas that produce some savings, as well as those things that should not be closed. I'll just say two things about answering questions directly. The first, on deprived areas. You will find that even after the budget, however it finishes up, is implemented, there is still a heavy skewing of services towards the more deprived parts of the city. That's always been the case. A lot of a lot of government money in the past has been directed towards the more deprived parts of the city. There's not so much of that around, but the council's budget has always in itself been skewed towards more deprived parts of the city where more help is needed, where there is greatest need, and that will continue to be the case. As far as specific buildings are concerned, my view has always been that actually it's the services that are important, not the buildings. Now, I know that's pretty hard to take for people who are used to using a particular respite care centre, or we had the same controversy 2 years ago when there was a proposal when we were in charge to close the Westerhope Day Centre. People feel very strongly about particular buildings. They're attached to them. People get used to being there and using those services. But actually what's really important is, are there some services available that meet their need, that perhaps are not always as convenient or allow them that emotional attachment, but still provide a fair service. The Newcastle City Council provides good services. I have to tell you that. It's a high spending authority providing good services in many, many areas, and we will still be providing better services than the majority and receiving greater grant support from the government than the majority. But this is a difficult time we're all in, and not everything can be saved.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I'll just pass the microphone to Anne from a, an academic perspective, an independent perspective.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, just on the point about certain areas are being affected, why are the most deprived areas being hit harder? I think in terms of youth work and community development, we've always, youth work, community development is a professional discipline. It's actually based on an understanding of communities, it's based on an understanding of young people and some of their vulnerabilities, which at times they need additional services for, but we don't target young people just because of vulnerabilities. We target young people because we want them to come to places where they feel safe, where they feel they're able to act and grow and develop at the heart of their own communities in a way that they identify for themselves. And when we look at the current cuts across Newcastle, we've done sort of a mapping of where some of the services are being cut, the libraries, the pools, and you can see predominantly it's in places like Elsick, Walker, Benwell, Scotswood, where there's massive cuts going to be made across some of those communities that are going to affect young people, children and the whole community. So I think that needs to be looked at, because at times like this, when we are going through so-called austerity and the council is having to make us take austerity measures, then those people are going to be predominantly more affected by the cuts that the council is saying they're making. Also, just in terms of youth and community work, youth and community workers have always been the bridge between communities and the council, and they work part of their work is about building relationships with young people, building relationships with families. You'll go to some areas where there are voluntary sector youth projects who are, at the moment, the amount of money that's available for them in terms of grant aid is becoming less and less. There's a whole commissioning process going on, which some of those voluntary sector youth projects have not been considered in, so they're struggling. And some people might say, well, where are the youth workers today? Actually, a lot of those people are just trying hard to keep their projects running against all the things that are happening. And then when you're talking about looking at vulnerable people and what their needs are, I wonder how the council identifies young people's vulnerabilities and what measures are taken to know about those things that make people vulnerable, because traditionally youth workers worked with young people in very safe environments based on a relationship with adults who they can trust and who they can know and who they can build relationships with, and it's only through that relationship that youth workers are able then to offer young people a listening ear, where the young people will talk to them about the very things that make them vulnerable, because they don't talk about those things in schools. Very often the things that make young people vulnerable are not talked about in families. So youth workers are in a position where they are making themselves available in those local communities for young people to talk to and to highlight what their concerns are, which is why it has to be coming from young people. And youth work gives that opportunity.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's a great... Could you put your hands together for a panel so far? I think they've done their best to explain how the cuts have been apportioned to young people. I've got a question here that was posed earlier, if I can just find it. And I would love you to get your green and red cards ready so we can have a physical representation. So again, your green cards mean yes, or you agree with that, and your red cards mean no. It's a question that came in from the current Newcastle Youth Council chair via Twitter, Lucy Bennett, 70 years old. She attends Newcastle College. Her question is, with the image of young people being constantly scrutinized, how do you propose to help improve these allegations whilst agreeing to cut fundamental services? So the question I pose to you now is, how many of you think young people have a good representation in the media? So if you think it's a good representation, you can put your green cards up. If you think it's a bad representation, put your red cards up. Wow. Okay, so for those who are listening online, there are a lot of red cards up in the room, and I believe our panelists can see this. So young people do know that. Thank you very much, everyone. So young people do know that we are being affected by bad press in the media. Now, we have seen statistics from researchers, and indeed we have requested more, where there's a presence of youth work and youth services, the rate of crime and antisocial behavior has gone down. So my question is, if you are really concerned with the rate of crime, why cut these fundamental services? Because, I mean, indeed, crime will probably go up, and social behavior will grow up. The issues of vandalism and so on, will that not incur extra costs for the council? David?
I think it's a logical connection, and that's exactly what Jessica Cripps was saying in her article in the paper just a few days ago ahead of this summit. And I agree. I think that it might knock on to the reputation of young people if the facilities that are there that do provide diversion, activities, involvement of young people aren't there anymore, and people are left to fend for themselves. There is an argument that says that will cause more aggravation, not necessarily more crime. I think people are very intolerant these days about young people just hanging around enjoying themselves. Certainly compared with my day, that degree of intolerance is reflected in a press that seems to be happy to be very negative in their stories about young people. And about life generally. It's much more negative than it used to be. So we all suffer a little bit from that. However, I think Matthew is right. I think there is definitely a risk there. I'll just say one thing. The disadvantage you get by inviting old fogies like me to come to these events is that we do reminisce sometimes. And I'll just say, I used to be a volunteer youth club leader and a Sunday school teacher in a place that's no longer there. It was a church in Heaton area called Bainbridge, and it was a thriving place, and it was one of many, many churches in this city that ran and supported youth services. The church ran and supported more services than the city council did a few 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now, it's no longer the case for a range of reasons. You need a thriving church and church community to have the facilities there that people can use, and sadly, people don't go to church so much, people don't volunteer so much. Frankly, things like the CRB checks and so on put people off volunteering. But we've reached the time when the council cannot afford to directly provide those services. Okay. It will commission from others, so hopefully there is a budget, a continuing budget to commission other providers of youth service, but they'll not be directly provided by the council, and does it matter as long as they're there and are good, but somehow we need to get volunteers to get back in like I used to be when I was younger.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to pass on to Anne to have a view.
Yeah, is that working? Is it working? Yeah, okay. Yeah, in terms of the media and the sort of demonisation of young people that's going on, I mean, that's been happening for quite a while, and I think at times like this, people always want someone to blame, and if you talk about young people and the demonisation, the criminality of young people, then it's easy to point the finger at young people and say, well, it's their fault, they're unemployed, they're using drugs, they're involved in getting ASBOs, blah, 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 and that's a way of kind of scapegoating young people, so I think there's a lot of that going on. In terms of the cuts the council are proposing that they're making, and I understand from the figures that I've seen because I've been to quite a few of the consultation events, and it looks like where I'd like to start is to say, the cuts that are happening to the youth service now are not the only cuts that have been made to the youth service. If you look back 7 or 8 years, to Newcastle City Council and you'd have been holding this consultation event then, we had the inner outer west teams, we had the inner outer east teams, we had a central team, and you'd have had maybe 50 or 60 full-time workers, youth workers working across the city. You'd have also had many, maybe double that in part-time workers, and you'd have had a whole stream of volunteers who were doing excellent work in those community centres and youth centres. So I think the council has to take some responsibility for how it's dismantled the youth service across the city over the last 7 or 8 years. My role in Durham is to teach youth work. Many people who used to work in Newcastle came through university with me, and we worked together. Those people went out and worked in their communities, and they held professionally qualifying posts where they were deemed with the responsibility to work with young people.
Okay.
Many of those people have gone now. So I don't think we can look at now in isolation. I think we've got to look back and see what has happened to the youth service, see how it's been dismantled, and also see if those services were there, how many young people were then accessing those.
Thank you very much, Anne. Please, if you do have any questions, just put your hands up and I'll get to you. I'm going to move to the floor now. Anna Worthy, you've got a question for me?
Hello. No. Thanks very much. I've got a question about the arts that you're cutting. Like, I'm really interested in arts, and I was just wondering why it's getting cut by 100%. Like, is that fair that it should be cut by 100%?
I've got a follow-up question from Martin Steele. He says also with regards to the cultural arts budget, how has Newcastle Council decided to reacted to the national coverage of the proposed cuts? Because indeed, even Eric Pickles, the local government and communities minister, has said, you know, maybe the leader of the council, Nick Forbes, has been too drastic in cutting the arts budget 100%, £1.6 billion. Councillor McCarthy. Million.
It isn't quite that, but the budget isn't that big. What do we think about the arts budget, and is it fair? None of these cuts are fair. I wouldn't want to be making cuts across services that I think are helpful and useful and help the city to thrive. But when we are proposing to stop doing youth work or stop doing play support for play work across the city, we've got to look at every bit of money that the council spends, and none of the proposals that are for arts cuts in the City Council budget stop those organisations from functioning. The amount of money that the Council gives to those organisations is very, very small, sometimes as low as 2.5%. The most of a proportion of what they have is about 15%. So actually what we will intend to do in the future is support them to find that money in a different way.
Joyce, sorry to come in there. Young people are saying, I mean, we're questioning the motive of the City Council, because indeed, in Gateshead, our sister borough, as I like to call it, just across the river, they're not cutting their arts budget by 100%. And I believe the future of this region is at stake. We're already suffering from, you know, the higher levels of unemployment and so on and so forth. We have had for over a few decades now a decreasing industry. And do you think arts is something that we could bring forth from Newcastle, from the northeast, in a way that, you know, we can begin to compete with the south? I'm going to ask David if he has any different views on this.
This is one area where Joyce and I differ. I think it's outrageous to cut 100% of the arts budget. I think it can't be spared taking a share of the cuts, but it should be no more than the proportionate. And if the city's losing and having to cut 30% of a total budget over 3 years, then the arts budget should be no more than that. And in any event, you need to give organisations time to adjust to a loss of grant. You can't just take it all away and expect them to survive. And I actually think there's a sort of misconception here, because it's thought that what will suffer will be, you know, the high art, or, you know, and why should we subsidise that? Actually, I'll tell you what's going to suffer. It'll be the learning and development teams. I know for a fact that's going to happen at the Theatre Royal if it loses 100% of its city grant, which is £650,000 a year. It's a lot of money. The learning and development team working in disadvantaged areas of the city, working with young people, getting them interested in creative projects. That's the sort of thing that will suffer. And I think that's just as important as some of the other work that goes on that gets funded by the city. So it shouldn't be 100%, it should be only proportionate to the overall cuts.
Thank you very much, David. Is there someone on the floor? If you please say your name and where you're from in Newcastle.
I'm Eleanor and I'm from Gosford. And I was wondering, do you not think that the cuts that are being made, especially to services that affect young people, are likely to have a very large psychological effect? And through things like cutting careers advice and places for young people to go, especially in these deprived areas, to get young people off the street, do you not think that people will end up losing a feeling of where their place is in society through the things like the youth service helping cutting 45% of crime in Benwell, to do with like young people feeling like they have a place to go? Do you not think it's going to, decrease the amount of people going to university if they're not getting careers advice or they don't have anything to do anymore? And it seems like the cuts that are being enforced by the government on the council and affecting young people just seems like we're going back to, the rich are the rich and the poor are the poor, and there's nothing you can do about that. It's just the way that it is through, these deprived areas, just, not helping young people, get out of their situations.
That's a very valid question. I'm going to pass on to Anne for a response.
I think in terms of putting services in local areas. Yeah, youth workers, thanks for the question. And I think youth workers don't actually go out just to keep young people off the streets, but it's a consequence of having youth centres, that young people have somewhere to go, they have somewhere where they can seek advice, they have somewhere they can go just because they're young people, And I think when youth workers the role of a youth worker is to be very aware of some of the issues that affect young people in their communities. Young people get to know the community, they get to know the families, they get to know the other organisations working in the community, and so they work together in partnership to provide the best service possible for the particular young people they work with. And in terms of the cuts that you're talking about, when we're talking about cutting the arts, cutting the libraries, those are also places that youth workers work with around young people's needs. And I think another point is it's very easy to think young people are just one homogenous group, but as we know, there are young people who have massive caring responsibilities. There are young people in different parts of Newcastle who come from, I think there's in some parts of Newcastle there's 57 different languages spoken, so they have different needs, so they come from different cultural backgrounds. We've got a big BME community in the west end of Newcastle, which we should be really proud of, and there's lots of differences around culture and heritage that those people live every day of their lives, just like Newcastle city centre. It has the arts, it has music. We've got a very, very long tradition in Newcastle of folk music, of the arts, of people who've come from Newcastle like Sting, Mark Knopfler, two of my favourites.
Okay.
But those,
Thank you.
I hope that answers
Yes,
the question.
it does. We have had someone tweeting in as you speak, and this is Tina McDonnell, and she says, she's questioning what will happen to galleries and museums, and will they remain free or will the prices go up? And is the cultural identity of the Northeast and indeed of all these ethnicities that we are enjoying will be protected? So that's a very good point. I'm going to pass to the floor just on the arts point before I pick someone. Neil Courtry is a youth. There's a question on the volunteering, taking over these issues. Can I have a microphone, please? Microphone.
Yes, hello. Just a very simple question. I feel that that museums and art galleries and libraries could perhaps stay open on reduced hours with the aid of volunteering work. Would the council support this?
Okay, and then that obviously goes in with a question via Twitter from Alex Wills. Says, couldn't youth volunteers be used to help out with other things? That is, for example, running youth clubs and reducing antisocial behaviour. So will the City Council support and help volunteering? I'll go with Joyce and then David.
Yes, absolutely. That is the way that we will have to do things in the future. And if we can protect some of those libraries, because we can ask volunteers in the local community to help run them, then I think if we can find community groups that can support that, I think we will help them, and we'll also do that with youth services in local areas. I mean, actually, in the area where I live, we've never had council youth work support. We've always had only volunteer support. So in where I live, that's what young people are used to. And I know that some of you who were interviewed for the television last night said exactly the same thing, that actually you can get hold of money, you will apply for money to help you run organisations, and I think the City Council will continue to do that if these proposals go ahead.
David?
Yeah, I agree on volunteers, and in my ward we brought the library into the community centre, and the community centre staff help the library staff run it, and I think that's a good idea, and it's a model that could be followed. My view, because we said about, let's hear alternatives, I would reduce the opening hours of all the libraries, including the City Library, in order to create enough staff time and enough budget saving to keep the other libraries running, even if they were on reduced hours as well. I think once you take a library away, it's very difficult to bring it back again. It's true of any kind of building-based service, I think. And I do think that we should do all we can to keep our community libraries open, whether it's volunteering, whether it's reduced hours, whatever it is.
Thank you very, very much, David. Questions from the floor? Dominic Wills? Yes, please just go ahead.
It's working. Should we not try and, with the more deprived areas, try and keep libraries open there, with a lot of people not going to school or not wanting to go to school, try and keep libraries up there, rather than and try and add more kind of libraries in schools, so which could be funded partly by the council?
Yeah, I would follow. I would then, expatiate on that. I mean, we have that, in areas where the youth service does work, in areas like Benwell, Byker, Cowgate, Westernwood, Kenton Bar, Brunswick, and Walker. These are areas, where initially, these are most. Is it not best if, I think I'm having an issue with the microphones here. But I think I'm talking too much. But is it not best if young people in these areas are, taking care of the best? I think I'm going to ask Anne for a view on this.
Can you say that question again?
It seems that people in the most deprived areas, such as Benwell and so on and so forth, are being targeted. So libraries in the north, it's very geographical, and these are already areas suffering from people, not in education, not in training. Is it not best to keep libraries in those type of areas open to encourage, such attitudes, as opposed to leaving them in areas where people are already, into the culture of, studying and reading?
Yeah, I think there's always been a place for libraries in all communities, because I don't know when the first Libraries Act came out, but it was always about making sure that people in local communities and some of the more deprived communities had access to information, had access to books, had access to things that were going to help them to develop their own knowledge base, know that they could access an education, which, had organisations like the WEA who were working in the communities and brought education to people who didn't necessarily go to school, go to college, go to university, but could have an education in their local communities. So in terms of libraries as well, nowadays they still serve the same purpose. We're talking about in April there's going to be massive changes to the benefit system, and the benefit system depends on people being able to go to the local libraries and access benefits through the computers there. So take those things away, then you're going to start thinking about transport costs and all the other add-ons for people who are living in more of the deprived or far-reaching communities that are going to have a much greater impact on them as well.
Okay, thank you. Just before I let Joyce come back on that, there are questions from the floor. Young gentleman.
Hello, my name is Adam, a youth worker from Changemakers, a UK charity. My question is more aimed at, with regards to the cuts to the youth service, and looking at the heritage of our country. With a lot of youth workers acting as the voice for applying for the projects within looking at our heritage, what will be put in place if they're cut to maintain the effectiveness of our heritage is put across to the younger generations, to make sure that that is not kind of lost within the young people of tomorrow?
So, Tom, do you have a follow-up question about Tom Hall? Just say, she's a youth worker, or youth apprentice.
I work at Newcastle City Council Youth Service, and we got these areas like Benwell, Walker, Biker, all these areas. And the thing is, when we go to these areas, there's young people telling us that when this service goes, that they're just going to go back to committing crimes. They're going to go back to doing nothing. I think it's just a shame that they're not getting that support that we can provide them, because I've not seen anybody else going in their areas and providing that same help.
I'm going to use a direct quote from your speech this morning, and you said when the council gets rid of swimming pools, where do young people go? Perhaps they go to a library. And you also said that when the council gets rid of libraries, young people will probably go to a youth centre. If the youth centre goes, and the youth workers go, and the youth advisors go, then where will young people go? I mean, I have heard reports from youth workers, and young people in areas across Newcastle have said, well, if there's nothing to do, we'll go petrol bomb police cars. So clearly, it may seem illogical, but these people, are in deprived areas, they have nothing else to do, and don't you think it would descend into such violence and social behaviour? Joyce?
I do hope that doesn't happen. What I think we will encourage young people and youth workers in the area to do is to apply for the funding that is available, because although the council will no longer provide youth work across the city, there will be money to support youth work and particularly preventative work through the EIG, the improvement grant that's available that tackles inequalities in the city. So we will have some money, and we do have some grant funding in the Newcastle Fund. So in the most deprived areas, I would expect some of that work to continue, and there will be a little bit of money that would support that. But we cannot maintain the services that we've currently got when we're faced with £100 million worth of cuts over 3 years. So I absolutely agree with you. Can I suggest that you write to Eric Pickles and to the Prime Minister to tell them how it's affecting you, and get your friends and colleagues to do the same thing, because although we would love to protect as much as we can't do that, and we need your help really in our lobbying. We're trying to lobby the government, but we need you to help us to do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Joyce. I mean, in the letter to the Prime Minister, the leader of the council, Nick Forbes, did say that there is disparity and Newcastle is being disproportionately hit. I think the national average is about £74 per head, and in Newcastle it's about 168. We are knowing the last week the government has actually increased the amount of money, you have to say, from 90 million to 100 million over 3 years. And I'm just going to go to you. You can follow up on the questions that have obviously come up in terms of youth work and the funding available.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, just about the funding. I mean, I got the statistics this week for the Newcastle Fund and how it's been allocated over the next 3 years. And there are 2 voluntary sector youth projects who've been given a small amount of money to run services across Newcastle. In those 2 projects are in very small little communities. So in terms of the rest of the city, I don't know that there is funding available. And I also understand that the Newcastle Fund was applied for and it was oversubscribed by 4 times the amount of money that was available. So I don't think there's funding there, and that's a big issue that we need to address. One of the things that's happened with the dismantling of the youth services is that there's this idea that we can commission services, and that youth workers, youth services can be commissioned to big national organisations, and that has happened to a point in Newcastle where Bernardo's won the commission for Newcastle, which is a big national organisation who I don't think they've had any history of delivering youth work in Newcastle. They have been involved in some services to children around social service, but not youth work. And the Bernardo's commissioning was won by, and which meant this project. Some of you may know about a project called Streetwise, which works with young people around sexual health, drug and alcohol use, teenage pregnancy, termination counselling, that kind of thing. And you can go there for advice around relationships. So it's a very specific kind of youth work. The other project was Children North East, who obviously do some excellent work across a part of the city and support the Youth Council. And then because the commissioning had to then subcontract to 2 organisations in Newcastle. One was Scotswood Area Strategy, and one was the YMCA. But within all that, if you think about that's 4 projects in the city, there was many other voluntary sector organisations, and the whole of the statutory sector youth service has gone as a consequence of that. So we need to review how that was done.
We're pressed for time and so many questions are coming through. I've got a question from Amelia, Youth Councillor. Amelia, on this issue of cuts and lack of funding. Microphone, please.
Could the Youth Council tax rich people more?
Okay, so that's slightly controversial. It's talking about taxing people more. So is the City Council considering taxing people more? I mean, if there are no funds, why not increase the amount of money that people pay in tax? The other issue is in terms of the Office of the Chief Executive of the City Council, and indeed, councillors like yourselves, should you not also be taking a hit? David?
Right, there's a few things in there. Let's take the big picture. We as a country want to have the lowest possible level of tax for individuals and the highest possible level of services. And you can't have it always. And if you look at countries like Scandinavia, they're high tax, but they're high quality of service. We really need to influence the way in which politicians think about this. I am in favour, apart from people at the bottom of the heap who should be lifted out of tax, I'm in favour of a high level of tax. But this is personal taxation, but this is not a great time to do it when people are under great pressure. So let's think about the council. I am in favour of council tax going up to relieve some of the pressure on these services. Let's make me absolutely plain about that. That is not in the proposals for the budget, but I do think we've reached the point where council tax should go up by no more than the rate of inflation, but if it went up 2 or 3% a year, even if we have to have a referendum, that builds money into the budget for future years. So I think council tax should go up to relieve the pressures on some of these cuts. Let me say one other thing, though, about where money might be available, just to pick up the last question. There are 26 wards in the city. We've all got ward committee budgets. They are being cut, but they're still substantial budgets. In my ward in Fordham, we spend at least half of the money on youth projects, on sports development projects, on projects in schools. Make that money work harder. You try and influence how that money is spent. You organise and bring proposals. And finally, one of the reasons why why local government is taking such a big hit is because obviously we have to address the deficit, but certain areas are being protected. Health has been protected, education has been protected. I would like to have a new dialogue with the schools about what they can do to spend some of their money, which has largely been protected and in some cases increased in deprived areas, to do something for the local young community in their community. I don't see why schools shouldn't put some money in to support youth projects in their community.
Thank you very much, David. We've got a question from the floor. Your name, where you're from?
I'm Johnny from Gosforth. I don't think that the question about the psychological impact and the aspirational impact on young people has really been answered. With the scaling back of services such as Connections, which can give some really great advice, and cutting things like the youth service, who really can develop a really good relationship with the young people and try and show them that there is another way to crime than crime, because people use it as sort of it's the easiest option for them, but if these services show that if people work hard, then they can achieve a lot more than what they can see.
So thank you very much, Johnny. So that's a very good question. We are worried about people's confidence and people's self-esteem. Joyce, you are a school advisor and you do youth work. In one of the publications from City Council, there's a section on capital investment and investing in the future. And of course there are industries that are being invested in. But I think what the council, in my opinion, have omitted is who is actually going to work in those industries. It's because the way it seems now, yes, we are looking for investment from around the world and across the country, but what about the young people in Newcastle? It seems as though they are being neglected. They are the future of this region. So if, for example, there are so many jobs and then none of the young people in this city are actually benefiting from it, then I don't see the use of investing in industries. all three main political parties, and indeed almost every other political party, always talks about the future. And this question is with credit to Tom Hall, and he talks about how if political parties are concerned with the future, how come it seems that, you know, cuts, especially in Newcastle, are being directly hit at young people? I mean, it is the future of industry that we're talking about here.
Thanks, Matthew. The question from Johnny and was it from Dominic earlier on the same issue? No, it might have been Elna, on the effect of on the effect of the cuts on young people and their aspirations and so on. I absolutely agree with you. What we are trying to do is to hang on to opportunities for young people like apprenticeships. So you will see in our budget that we're trying to protect that. Might be a reduction in number, but it's a really important offer for those young people who aren't going to go into further education off to university. I agree that with Johnny that it is about encouraging you all to have high aspirations, and I want you to achieve that potential that you've got and have every opportunity. When Matthew introduced me, he said I was passionate about equality. I am, and that's about all of you having as much opportunity as you can to achieve what you want to do and have as many chances in life as you need. I'm worried about this link with crime. And in times of austerity, previously, in the Great Depression and subsequently, when there's been not as much money around, there is generally a rise in crime. Sometimes that's tied up with that kind of economic problem. But I don't want us collectively, young people, to think that we think that you're all going to start committing crime, because actually I don't think you're going to do that. But you are also being hit by the cuts, aren't you? When you want to go to the pictures, or you want to spend your money, buy a game, buy a DVD, or whatever you're wanting to do, all of those things have gone up in price. And unfortunately we're all being hit by that, aren't we? Things are costing us more. I think the more that we can do in the authority to support you in doing that. I mean, David has said that schools' money is protected. Not quite really, but they've kind of not being hit as much as other parts of the system. And so I agree with all of you. You all applauded that. I think that's a really good idea, that we work with schools and see what we can get from them.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Anna, you just have 30 seconds to come back on this issue. I know it's a brief time, but we're running out of time, on this issue of the future of Newcastle and, young people's opportunities and investment in young people.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I think in terms of what Joyce said, about the cuts and the effect on young people's access to careers advice and the stigmatisation of young people. I know that the council is proposing that it keeps its 32 street wardens, and when I went to one of the consultation events I was sort of asked the question about and what about the contact that they have with young people, and I was told that they would be the term that was used was to use more punitive measures when coming across issues around antisocial behaviour. So that is a major concern of mine, because that already stigmatises and criminalises young people before they've even acted. We all know that young people just hanging around on the street corners for some people is a problem. It's not a problem for us, because we know that young people like to hang around. We all like to hang around. But for young people, if they have nowhere else to go, they're more likely to be hanging around on the street. Yeah, and we know the way ASBOs work, the antisocial behaviour orders, you can get one of those just for annoying someone. Or being a nuisance. So
I'm just going to have to interrupt you. Of course, that is, the record of young people and their prospects for employment and so on in the future. There's a question from the floor from Niwa. I believe you're from West Denton. 12. Go ahead.
I think there's always a way. Keep all our things open. Swimming pools.
Sorry. So if you could just make yourself a bit more audible, please.
I think there's always a way. Keep all our things open. Swimming pools that we have been going to since we were tiny. Parks that we still hang out in every day. Like the saying goes, Rome was not built in one day. The government really try hard, even though it's not going to affect their generation. It's going to affect ours. So it's down to us. What they do affect us. Their choices affect us. So we should decide what's really to happen, to pick our decisions.
Thank you very much. So that's an amazing point coming from Newell there, that, you know, there is always a way out, and we, as young people, we do hope and believe that these costs should be spread around as opposed to just, you know, targeting, and I use that word very carefully, young people. It should be spread around across society. Sarah Bontoft also sent via Twitter, why is it that young people are being affected more than adults? So this is how young people do feel they're being victimized. And my personal standpoint is, young people cannot vote, and I believe, quite frankly, that is the reason why the council maybe has decided, you know, to deal with them first. So is there any way you can come up on this?
Actually, I support the move to give people the vote at 16, and I would support you if you were putting that forward, actually, and I think we could have a really good debate about that, because I think you deserve the vote at a younger age than you currently get it. Do the cuts affect young people more than adults? That might be your perception. I actually think we're cutting a huge number of services, some of which you've talked about today. Things like the closure of the libraries will affect lots of adults across the city. So I don't know that they're targeted, and it certainly won't affect, in the main, your education support, and it won't affect the proposals that we're putting forward, won't affect support for the most vulnerable at the moment. You know, people looked after children who are looked after by the local authority. Those young people in the main are going to be as much protected as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you. David, I'm going to give you 30 seconds as well. What do you think?
If it's true that older people are getting an easy deal compared with younger people, then it's a national issue. It's not just here. And I would agree with it, actually. And I think it's time we dealt with things like concessionary fares on public transport. We can't influence that as a council, but I know a lot of older people who say, look, we don't mind paying something if that frees up some money somewhere else to support youth transport or support services for young people. So we've got to tackle some of these issues nationally as well as locally.
Thank you very much, David. Oh, to time. Exactly. Two last questions from the floor. I'll first start off with Katie Cowie.
Hello, and thank you. When me and Mr. Kosh are here, we're discovering about the services. We were astounded to find a lot of the services that were being cut, such as leisure centres, youth centres. We found a lot of them being in the north and the west of the city, mainly the more deprived areas. I want to stress that point because isn't it that the more deprived areas need it more than the better off areas? Have you thought about that? Because like the east of the city, I mean, some people do not need those services, and the people in the west of the city do. So how are you going to answer that?
So how is that fair? I'm also going to ask a question from Simran. The last question from the floor for today.
Gosh, pressure. My question was kind of a suggestion. I mean, from before we were talking about getting more volunteers. Would it be possible to sort of advertise volunteering vacancies, if you like, in schools? Like, you know how schools occasionally have assemblies and things. Maybe they could just read it out or put it together with, I don't know, the DAV scheme, which has a section on volunteering. So people know they have to volunteer at that point, and maybe that's how we could build up the volunteering sort of body we need. That was just a suggestion. Okay.
Thank you very much, Simran. That's a great suggestion from the floor and from Katie as well. We are coming to the very end of this panel discussion, and it has been very, very fruitful. So as you speak now, I think this will be your last comments, you know, to wrap everything up and get everything. So politicians, I know you want to ramble on. We're going to have to squeeze everything you want to say into a few seconds. I think I'm going to start with Joyce. Yes.
Look at me when you say ramble on. I'm really pleased that I've been here this afternoon to hear your comments, and please fill in the form. Please help us with the lobbying of the government and make sure that the people nationally who are making these decisions, who are restricting the choices that we can make on your behalf, understand how you feel, because I think that's the really important part of today's work. Thank you.
I agree that some of the answer to this question is in volunteering, similar to the last point, except that let's remember volunteers need support as well, so that support to help them, to train them, to make them effective needs to be in place. I think it's back to the difficult situation we have nationally and locally, but there are choices, and remember that's what this budget consultation is about, how the council are making the choices. I think they've made some wrong ones, I've tried to suggest some other ones, but difficult times we have. have, but have your voice about these choices.
And finally, our non-partisan panelists, Anne Marin.
Thanks, Matthew. Yes, I just want to thank everyone for all the really good questions and for all the thinking that you've encouraged me to have when I've been answering the questions. And as I've said many times, I just want to see Newcastle as a vibrant place that young people feel as much a part of as everyone else, where they have access to the arts, to music, to youth centres, to careers advice, to jobs, to work, to whatever they need in order to develop into active citizens that will make Newcastle the place that we all want it to be, that it has been in the past, and I don't want to see anything that's going to stop that from happening. And I do believe, because of my own experience and the many committed youth workers in the city over the years who also want that to happen, I believe youth work plays a primary role in that.
Thank you very much, Annie, for putting that together for her. So finally here today, I'd like to say thanks to our panelists for coming down. We do appreciate your presence here today. I mean, young people are being treated importantly for you to grace us, here today. We also want to say thank you to all those listening online. Thank you for tuning in. Please do stay active using the hashtag NYCS13. Thank you to all of you here that have turned out today, no matter the weather. We do appreciate your presence here, and we hope you have been able to send your or give your questions directly to the panelists. The day will go on. We have a 5-minute break after this, and then we'll also have a final workshop. On the 31st of January, for those listening, the Youth Council will be presenting a report from this debate to the leadership of the City Council at 2 p.m. Again, this evening, the Youth Council will feature on BBC Look North by 5:20. So I am Matthew Otubu, and I've delivered this debate live from the Great Hall of the Discovery Museum. Thank you.